Hey, I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Mission Matters. My name is Adam Torres, and if you'd like to apply to be a guest on the show, just head on over to missionmatters.com and click on Be Our Guest to apply. All right, so today I have Keith Richardson on the line, and he is co-founder over at More in Common. Keith, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Adam. I appreciate you having me, man.
Oh, man. So I'm excited to have you on the show. I've been trying to get you and Rodney booked for a while now, and I know we'll be doing a follow-up interview as well for everybody listening. So today we'll be covering, of course, the new book that Rodney and Keith have coming out with Mission Matters, but we're not going to give all of the spoiler alerts away. We're not going to give all the content because we're bringing them both on the show for an in-depth interview on their writing. But the goal today is to really get more into More in Common, the idea behind it, why it was founded, and all the great work you're doing, and then we'll touch on the book as well. Keith, we'll start this episode the way that we start them all, with our Mission Matters Minute. So Keith, we at Mission Matters, we amplify stories for entrepreneurs, executives, and experts. That's our mission. Keith, what mission matters to you?
I've thought a lot about this question. It's human connection, Adam. You know, when we think about the nature of the world that we live in so many ways, we spend a lot of time, energy, and effort on helping people with finding themselves and self-promotion. And how do I get this job? And how do I do all of these things? And at the end of the day, we have a biological need for connection. We don't function solo. We don't operate solo. And we just think that by having more productive human connection and focusing at its very core, basic nature of it, that we can heal a lot of things amongst each other, which, as we were talking before the show, it got me thinking, you love doing this. And a big reason you like doing it is because of the connections that you make. I'm going to give you a curveball because I really want to understand, like, what is it about the connections that drives and gives you energy?
On my end, really, it's the opportunity to come on here and to provide a platform for individuals like yourself and Rodney to get their message heard. So we find that it's so hard to get an entrepreneur, an executive, for them to cut through the noise and to get their message heard, and also to have a production company or an outlet that's a nice, safe, trusted place to tell the story as well. So as I was looking into your background and also into Rodney's background, and as we were kind of going through selection for who would be featured in the book, when I learned more about the More in Common story and then more about both of your stories, I'm like, oh yeah, this is one of ours. This is part of our community. And so the content that we focus on is always centered on that. So I guess just to get us kicked off here, Keith, I'd like to know a little bit more about like how this idea for More in Common started. Like, where did the Rodney and Keith connection start? The 1-2 punch.
A 1-2 punch. Well, it manifests in a story, and I'll tell that story. But Rodney and I have known each other now for 20 years. We met back in college, and it's one of those things like instant friendship. Where does that come from? What was interesting about our friendship is, I grew up in New Hampshire. Rodney grew up in Indiana. Rodney grew up in a very religious household. I did not. And we would end up having these conversations in the gym back in college. And we're not talking, after years of friendship. We're talking about after months of friendship. And we would just have these conversations about religion, about gay marriage, especially at that time, 2002. It was a big thing in the news, and it's a big thing again at the moment. But, we would talk about all of these things and always come out with a stronger relationship at the end. And we wouldn't think much of it, right? And then fast forward to 2016, Colin Kaepernick knelt for the national anthem. And I remember I turn on ESPN and I see it's like just a couple of days. Like, this is the early stages of the thing. And Rodney is a big 49ers fan. And I reached out to him because he's my best friend and he's a Niners fan. And I'm like, hey, I wanted to know what he thought of the whole thing. I was curious. He asked me what I thought of it. And I was like, man, I don't like it. And that was my first response. And so it took some time because he had to research it. He didn't really know what was going on. And then we started having this conversation. And he literally gave me about 45 minutes to share all kinds of just thoughts that I had about it. That they weren't like cogent, well thought out thoughts, but they were just the thoughts and the things that I was feeling around the situation. And what's interesting, and he tells this later, this is his part of the story, but I'll tell it because he's not here. Rodney's black. right? And we had been friends at this time, we're friends for 14 years.
Mm-hmm.
And he had all kinds of conflict. Like, why is it that his best friend, doesn't understand this situation? Why, like, this makes sense to him. Like all of the things that he lives and the perspectives that he has and all of this. And that just wasn't where I was coming from, right? I just wasn't thinking in that point of view. But he was angry, he was frustrated, but he didn't show it, right? Like he just let that space happen where I got to share. And then from there, I asked him what his take was. I gave him the same space. And we end up having this amazing conversation. At the end of it, it was like, oh, I get it now. I understand where it's coming from. And we ended up moving forward. I ended up moving forward with very different point of view than I had even going into that dialogue. And he says to me, this is what I want to start a podcast about. Right. Yeah. He's like, I want to start a podcast. Like, for whatever reason, we're good at this.
Yeah.
Right. Like we don't know why, but we were good at this. And so we end up starting this podcast, and 150 episodes currently out there. We will bring it back. It's currently on hiatus because we're working on some coaching opportunities that we've built, because over the last 3 years, we finally started honing in on what that formula looked like. Like, what is it that we do that gets us to that space, and why do we care about it? Like, what is it that we care about? It's one of those things, like when you're good at something and you figure out what it is, you want to share it with people and you want to help other people find it, because I think there's a yearning for it. There's a resistance to it. And then there's this cultural element that says it's not possible. And we just don't think, we think it is possible. It's going to take time and patience and working through it. But that's the story. Like, that's where this started. And that was in 2016. And here we are 6 years later with you.
How does, when you're going from concept to launching something new, obviously, it's been a progression. You guys have known each other a long time. And I think it's just a really interesting story. Like, I can think about like the idea of having, it originally started from conversations in the gym, right? Just these thoughtful conversations. And as it evolved, and as you've seen that the market was in need of a platform like yours, when did you get to that point, or how did you get to the point where you're like, okay, yeah, we need to make this an actual business. Like, this is a real thing. Like, there's a definite void in the marketplace for what we offer.
Slowly and backwards. Ronnie and I always like to joke that we do everything backwards, right? Like, we just jump in. What's interesting is, like, from a business standpoint, so we've worked with a couple of organizations, right? And where we plug in is around diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies. And we really focus on creating an environment of inclusion. Like, that is our charter. Like, how do you actually create an environment of inclusion? What does that mean? What does that look like? Who's doing what? So the start, to directly answer your question, it was like, first Rodney said, let's do a podcast. And I had no idea what podcasts were at the time. So I'm like,
podcast.
I don't know what you're talking about, dude, but okay, that sounds good. So we end up doing that. And we went backwards into that, and that's a whole different thing. But like, from the consulting side of it, it was like, wait a second, there's something here, right? Because it's hard. I mean, let's be honest. It's hard if you're doing something in the neighborhood. Like, people have, what is the shared and common purpose, right? Of people in the neighborhood to sit and talk about charged topics. If you can't find that, it's going to be really hard to make that space productive, right? And drive that productive human connection. Like, that productive piece is important. But in a business or in an organization, or even one-on-one, where we do one-on-one coaching, there is an easy common purpose. Like, at the very basics, like, I want to keep my job and I want to do what's right for the company that I work for, and I want to help the organization grow, right? So we can build on that. And that was the one piece. But we got this opportunity. Like, we just got an opportunity. And someone said, hey, I need help to do something. And we were like, sure, we'll do it. And we put it together in 2 weeks, and we delivered it to 150 people. And we were like, oh, we have something here. So it wasn't this, oh, let's do this idea and deliver it where there's a need. It was like, oh, there's a need. Hey, we'll make something for that. And then 3 years later, we fine-tuned it and really started to make it something that can be utilized. Yeah.
Let's stick on the podcast side of things for a little longer.
Sure.
I think it's interesting that you weren't weren't necessarily a podcast fan and you're like, what's that? Like, what was your experience with podcasting? Because I'll to be upfront, I sound biased. I'm 100% sure
I know
because
you
I'm,
love it.
I'm founder of a podcast network and we podcast
Yeah,
all day around here. We launch
totally.
shows, but I always like to hear from somebody who didn't know what it was and then they started one
Yeah.
and then they got, they got some type of result or there was just something that happened to them. Like, what was your experience?
Goodness. Well, first of all, I miss it.
Yeah.
And we will
get
bring
it going,
back.
man. Start it back up. This is
We got to
another
get
day,
it going.
but get it going.
It's
Come
a
on.
lot of work, dude. Like, it's so much work to do a podcast. You would think it wasn't. And some people say it's not, right? Like they just hit record and go live. Okay.
Yeah.
Hey, it's just not our style, right? Like production value and all that other stuff. It has been one of the most amazing experiences of my life. And I know it's a little hyperbolic to say, but it's true. And sometimes it's only when I look back on it, right? Because of the people I've gotten to meet. Like I got to meet Kristen Bell and Catherine Hahn, and I got to meet professors from NYU and LMU, Loyola Marymount University. I've gotten to meet PhDs across, like there's so many amazing. I've gotten to meet people in Ireland and young people.
It's fun. The podcasting community is fun. I tell people that all the time. It's a whole new world.
And these are the guests that we brought on.
Yeah.
And I mean, but I'll tell you that from the beginning, it was super nerve-wracking, right? Because you've got this idea and now you're going to put it out into the world where it can be criticized. And if you haven't done that before, which I had not,
it's a learning curve. That's the thing.
Yeah, it's super nerve-wracking. And then we started bringing on interviews and, you start to learn, like, what is your approach? I learned more about how I can better engage other people and get to know other people and what I'm like, all of this stuff that we deliver and talk about to teach, like 150, it's actually more. We didn't release all the episodes, but let's say 150 of these conversations, like deep conversations. We get really deep on our podcast and like you just get to meet people. You get to know people. It has been one of the coolest experiences.
And I think one of the things that you mentioned about it being deep and meaningful, the other good part about it is now you have a catalog out there. Like those 100%. Conversations are recorded, like you collaborate, like you created something new that others can benefit from going forward. So whether you start it back up, which I really hope you do, because I think you and Rodney are awesome. And I know that you do meaningful work. So I think it's great. But outside of that, even if you didn't like that, those conversations are now documented. Like that goes into the, the brain trust, right? That is the content. Like, and because you put so much thought behind it and the way that you approached it as a craft got better. I'm sure from episode 1 to 100%. Episode 50, you sounded one way. From 50 to 100, completely different show. Like that's 100%. The natural progression of learning.
100%. I'll never forget our first interview. It was 3.5 hours long.
3.5 hours
of recording. And we were like, we got to make this an hour. And the amount of editing that went into taking that disjointed conversation into something that you could listen to, we learned quickly that we aren't to do that again. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. So that took a week or a month to get out.
God. Yeah. And we were doing once a month at that time. So we had the time, but and we're learning to edit and deal with audio stuff. And we're doing all that on our own.
I got it.
It was an adventure.
So let's spend a little bit of time on the book here. And like I said, let's scratch the surface on the book because we'll be bringing you both back on to do a deep dive into it. But what are some of the things that you hope the readers of your work get out of what you write?
So first, like just at a high level, going back to what mission matters is the importance and the ease of human connection. It's not easy and it's simple, right? So sometimes it can be super overwhelming when we think about all of the information that we have coming at us in every different facet of our life. And I'm not just talking about technical stimulation. I'm talking emotional stimulation, mental stimulation, personal, family, business, physical pain, emotional pain, all of that stuff coming at us in droves. It can be really difficult to then navigate the spaces that we have with others. And it can seem impossible, especially when we disagree with somebody. And I'm not just talking about disagreement politically, which is kind of the flashy thing to talk about.
Yeah.
I'm talking about disagreement, like about anything. One of my favorite guests from the podcast, Professor Dolly Chugh, she studies bias at NYU, and she wrote this book. And in it, she talks about forks up or forks down in the dishwasher, right? And like how this is an irreconcilable point of conversation between her and her husband,
gosh.
right? But it's those little things, right, that we all have some sort of emotional or mental attachment to that we seemingly identify with, and it creates a divide.
What was the
between us
answer?
and the other
Forks up
person.
or forks down?
Dude,
I gotta know.
I'm a forks up person.
Oh,
I'm totally
I'm a
a forks
forks
up.
down person. I'm sorry to know this.
I'm a knives down, forks up.
I hope we're all knives down.
Here's the interesting thing about that podcast is if
we're not all
yeah,
knives down. Hold on.
I don't know. But my theory on forks up is that they seemingly get cleaner, but I don't have any data to support that forks are actually cleaner when they're up versus when they're down, right? So it's like, oh, that was the conclusion of our dialogue on it. It's like, oh, we should get some data on that and see if it actually works and serve this. But for the book. So the nature of human connection, right?
Yeah.
Like in its importance and its relevance, and this idea, like I talked about individualism, like individualism is important. Like I want you to live your best life, right? Like, and your best life is not dictated by me or anybody else. It is like what makes you happy and what gets you going. But at the same time, I also want to be interested in what that is for you. And I want you to be interested in what it is for me. And they don't have to be the same thing. And that's human connection. Right? Like that's the simplicity of it. It can be challenging, it can be hard, but that's really what I hope people get out of it through some of the tips that we talk about in there and some of the ways that we can build spaces that allow people, man. Like I'll stop my ramble here in a second. There's this foundational component. I've heard somebody else say it. I couldn't attribute to it, but it's something that we talk about a lot is feeling seen, heard, and valued. One of the biggest dividers between people is when you just dismiss me, judge me, and critique me for who I am. Like we lose it instantly. If I tell you I like forks up and you say, there's an instant division there, right? Joking, not in a non-joking, judgmental manner. And all of us, you, me, want to be able to say what's on our mind and in our hearts and just be heard. We don't have to be agreed with. This is what happened in the Kaepernick conversation. Rodney just gave me space to hear me. I ended up finding myself to think I was on the wrong side of that story. I wasn't on the wrong side of that story because Rodney told me I was. I was on the wrong side of that story because I heard what he said and it added value to the existence that I want to live. And I thought, oh, I came to that conclusion, but because we had that connection. So I'm hoping that's what people get out of our chapter and some of the things that we can help. And
all right, I'm cutting it there because that's going to be the cliffhanger for everyone. We want you to pick up the book, and we got another interview coming up as well. But I do want to jump around a bit here. More in Common. You've given us a little bit about what you do. Let's go further. Tell us a little bit more about the company.
Yeah, so we have a philosophy of coaching that is based on managing time and information, right? And so we're about simplicity in order to navigate the complex. So we've built this framework that we bring to individuals in a one-on-one coaching environment and into organizations where the need is there to help create spaces of psychological safety for others and to help people create psychologically safe spaces for others, right? Psychological safety is this thing that is so incredibly valuable to productive human connection. Getting it seems super hard, but it is very simple. And so we have, some consulting, we have consulting work that we do within organizations, and then we have one-on-one consulting and coaching that we'll provide to executives who are trying to do and deliver this to their teams and their people.
What types of organizations do you find typically get the most value out of working with you and your team?
Organizations that I'd say are looking to try to improve their culture, right? Like how do we create this? The inclusion is how do we get inclusion, right? Like we have this diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy. As an organization, diversity is fairly metric-based, equity is outcome-based, but how do people navigate one another? How do we actually do that? And so organizations that are trying to do that will get a lot of value out of us. Organizations that are trying to move their culture forward so people contribute to the growth of the organization are going to be organizations that like to work with us. And then leaders who are trying to because we have a whole assessment strategy as well. So we have assessments built into all of these. Individual leaders who are one-on-one want to figure out how they can be better based on where they are today and how they can improve, certainly are great for us to work with as well.
And so I know one of your missions and one of the things that you and Rodney are focused on is breaking organizations out of their echo chambers. So, I mean, first off, maybe define echo chamber and what this looks like.
The echo chamber is really, it's just our bubble, right? Where we surround ourselves with information to affirm our confirmation bias, to affirm our personal value that we have attributed to whatever that information helps us find ourselves in. And then we surround ourselves with people who affirm that too, right? And there's deep psychology that goes into the ability to break out of these echo chambers in a lot of ways. And then there's shallow psychology that allows us to break out of these echo chambers. We're not therapists, so we're not at the deep level, but we try to help navigate the in-between, right? Between the shallow and the deep. And really the echo chamber is just you standing in your chamber and hearing back everything that you say. So you are ultimately feeling that you are right. And valued. And this speaks back to being seen, heard, right? Like an echo chamber is a great way to be seen, heard, and valued, but it is not necessarily the most productive way to move forward.
Yeah. And it makes so much sense. And when you think about like, I mean, our biggest echo chamber nowadays, right? Our social media feed, right? The algorithm sees what we
tells
like,
you everything you need to know.
They give it to you. And that's all you get back, point to where you may have a belief or a bias that is just way off. And again, not even politically like anything. If somebody, this would be mean, but if somebody ran ads about why forks need to be up in dishwashers,
dude,
and if you clicked
right
on
in your
one,
feed.
and if you were retargeted, you might very well believe that that's 100% like empirically, like that is the correct thing. You put out some content around it, a bunch of informational tutorials, and before you know it, you would be thinking that forks up is the only way it's ever been in the history of the world. But there's a possible other side of the opinion, which you don't get unless you're outside of that echo chamber. Am I off on this?
No, there's this. So you talk about bias, you mentioned bias. There's this thing called the self-validation bias, right? Where it's when we see information that taps into something that we already believe. And I love this example, forks up, right? And all of a sudden I get Bill Nye, right? He's in my feed and he gives me all of this stuff that now all of a sudden it's like, boom, that's right.
Yeah.
Because he's
Bill Nye,
an authority figure. He's all this. So forks up it is. And we don't see Neil deGrasse Tyson over here who says, forks down, that actually doesn't matter, right? Yeah. We don't end up getting that point of view because it's like, boom, self-validation bias. I'm good. I feel better. I've proven that I was right the whole time.
Oh my gosh. But I feel like Bill Nye could convert everyone though. He might. If that's the one influencer that could get everybody to change everything.
He might come up with something crazy.
Oh man. Well, Keith, I'll just say, it's been great having you on the show and connecting about your book, your podcast, obviously more in common. I just have to ask, what's next for you? What's next for you? What's next for the company?
Well, I think the big thing that we're working on right now is very much the one-on-one coaching. We see a huge opportunity in that based on our business model and really helping individuals one at a time, not the most scalable. Will work with organizations, but really building that out. So we're working with an industrial psychologist to build out a series of assessments to tap into some of these things. And then we work through the tools and tips that we have, and then we go through a series of practices. So we're in the process of building that out and piloting that to a handful of our core advisors. And that's really the next drive for us as we continue to try and help organizations do the same.
It's big. And if somebody wants to learn more and connect with you and your team, what's the best way for them to do that?
So the best way to connect with us, and you can go at More in Common Pod. We haven't changed our social handles from pod to ENT, so it is still at More in Common Pod. Hey, roots, right? We're on Twitter Instagram. You can DM us on any of those platforms, and you can even, find us on Facebook or LinkedIn as well. LinkedIn is probably the best social platform for us, but you can certainly email us, contact@moreincommonent.com, and that'll route to either one of us. You can email us. I do most of my communication via email, so I get most of that, whereas Rodney does most of the communication on social. So the best way would be email at contact@moreincommonent.com.
Awesome. And we'll put that information in the show notes so that our audience can just click on the links and head right on over. And speaking of the audience, if this is your first time engaging with Mission Matters or listening to an episode or viewing one, we're all about bringing on business owners, entrepreneurs, and executives that are mission-based, that have something more to offer and to amplify their message. Like, how do we all learn and grow from the content? And what do we all learn? Like, if that's the type of content that sounds interesting or fun or engaging to you, hit that subscribe button, because we have many more mission-based individuals just like Keith and Rodney coming up on the line, and we don't want you to miss a thing. Keith, it really has been a pleasure. That forks up, forks down thing, I'm going to start polling people, but in all sincerity, like, More in Common, I wish you and Rodney much more success, and I'm looking forward to launching this book with you both.
You as well, Adam. Thank you for your time, and I appreciate everything that you guys do.